Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over the Alapin variation, which stems from the Sicilian defense. Sicilian defense is pawn to e4, pawn to c5. You've probably seen this. This is one of the most common defenses in all of chess because it really gives black a fighting chance. There's a lot of sharp variations. Black has a lot of different ways that he can actually take the initiative in the game. So a lot of top players, GMs, club level players will play this not only because it gives them an opportunity to draw, but there's so many different ways for black to take over the game and actually win the game. So a lot of white players actually don't play e4 because they're afraid of pawn to c5. So today we're going to be going over a different variation that I recommend. It's kind of the anti-Sicilian attack from white. Most times you'll see, knight to f3, you'll see pawn to d4. These are things that black wants to see because it allows them to go into their sharp variations that most of them have studied up on. But the Alapin variation is just pawn to c3, and it tries to do two things. One, the Alapin variation tries to take away all the initiative that black wants to gain in the game. So that's very, very important. To get your opponent out of their comfort zone is extremely important. The second thing is white really wants to gain control of this d4 square right here. Very, very important in chess, especially in the Sicilian defense. Black playing pawn to c5 really wants to gain control of this square without even using his center pawn. So very, very important. Again, this is the anti-Sicilian, and this is used by many, many of the greatest chess minds of all time. Many GMs, world champions. If you've seen the series that we did on Kasparov versus Deep Blue in 1996, the first game Deep Blue beat Kasparov, and then the second game Kasparov came back and used the Alapin variation to beat Deep Blue. So it's very, very strong, and you see it all levels of chess. Now in this video we're going to be going over the 5 most common moves that you'll see from black, and then a lot of different variations within those, so you kind of have a good idea of how to play this, what different things you should be looking for, and kind of how to approach it. But again, going back to the original things, we're just trying to take back the initiative. This is going to transition nicely into the middle game, and it's really going to take away all the Sicilian variations that black's really used to. So the first move we're going to be going over is knight to f6 right here, and black's just going to continue to push forward and just attack that knight with pawn to e5. Now, black has a lot of different ways he can move right now. As you can tell, knight just going right back to g8 is going to be a mistake. It really gives even more initiative to white right now. You never really want to be moving your knights back as far as developing them and then moving them back to the 8th or 1st rank. So that's going to be a mistake. You can tell that knight to h5 is going to be a mistake. The queen's going to take it, and that really goes along with if the knight comes down to g4, that's going to be a mistake. It's also going to be a mistake if he brings his knight down to e4. All white has to do now is just kick his pawn up to d3 right now. The knight no longer has anywhere to go. He's going to be taken. He can't come back to d6, f6 right here. And again, if he tries to come over here to g5 or g3, he's going to be taken by either a bishop or a pawn. So that's going to be a mistake. So as you can tell, the only really move that black has is to bring his knight over to d5. So from here, white's just going to play pawn to d4. Now, black does have a few options from here. The first one that you'll see is just with black taking right here on d4. Now, white can take back right away, but he doesn't necessarily have to. First, white's actually going to develop his knight here to f3, and that's because he's not really worried about this pawn coming down to c3, because this pawn was blocking this knight here on d5. So you don't have to worry about getting that material back. You're going to get it back eventually, but you don't need to go right away. You can go ahead and bring your knight over here to f3 first. So the knight's going to come right here. Now black has a decision to make, but let's say he brings his knight over here to b6 or c6. Simple development move, trying to control the center of the board, protecting one of his pawns right now. Then white can go ahead and take. Now again, what do we want to control the center of the board with? You always want to control the center of the board with your pawns, and then you have your minor pieces protect those pawns, especially in the early game. Now, as we move into the middle game and end game, those things change, but early on, you control the center of the board with your pawns. So when you're thinking about which piece you're going to take with, is it going to be the knight? Is it going to be the pawn? We're definitely going to be taking back with our pawn. Pawn's controlling the center of the board. So from right now, as you can tell in this variation that we've gone over, white has a very, very firm foundation in the center of the board. This anti-Sicilian. This is not Sicilian at all from Black's perspective. Very, very well developed. This knight here on f3 is both defending both of these pawns right here, and it's very, very nicely gaining control of the center of the board. So that is what happens if that pawn takes here on, if we come back here to d4. You might also, instead of the pawn taking first here on d4, the knight could come over here to c6 first. A lot of times these are all going to kind of go into the same place, end up in the same variation, but from here, all White's going to do is continue with the same thing, is bringing his knight here to f3. This is a very, very important square for this knight. You see this typically, the knight coming to f3, but in this case particularly, it's really defending all the critical squares early on into the game. So from here, it doesn't really matter, if the pawn takes right here. If not, White can continue to develop. He can always bring his bishop involved into the game. He can pin down this knight if he wants to, castle on the king side. But again, once this pawn takes, all White has to do is take back. He's really gaining a strong center of the board. So again, this is what happens from the very beginning if the knight comes down to f6. Next variation we're going to be going is if the pawn goes to d5. Now for a long time it was thought that pawn to d5 from Black was kind of the go-to move. That kind of fell out of favor, and again, it was that knight to f6 being the main line. This was kind of the secondary move that people kind of try to bring back. But from here, White's just going to exchange on d5. So he's going to take with his pawn here, and then the queen's going to come down to d5 and take. Now, White's just going to continue to push forward again. He wants to gain control of that d4 square. Common theme, take all the initiative back and gain control of this d4 square. And he does that, he can just play pawn to d4. Again, if White takes, White's just going to retake with his pawn right here. If Black wanted to, he could always, try to develop his knight. He could bring his knight here to f6. White could bring his knight here to f3. Again, trying to gain control of this d4 square right here. Doesn't really matter where Black's going. I do want to go over another thing that you'll a lot of times see in the Alapin variation. So we'll go ahead and bring the knight here to c6. One thing that you'll see is that this knight right here, typically this knight will come to c3. That as far as simple development move from White, you'll see that in a lot of variations throughout chess. In the Alapin variation, it's a little bit different because, as you can tell, we move our pawn to c3 early on, which is a slight disadvantage because you would like to control the center of the board with your knight, especially early on. So you have one of two options. One is if your dark square bishop comes out into the game. Once he's out, you can now bring your knight to, let's say, d2 if you need to. You got to make sure that it's the right time. But another idea that you always have is bring your knight initially to a3. Now, later on to the game, you definitely want that knight to be in the center of the board, but you can always bring your knight to a3, and then if you wanted to, you could bring, your bishop to c4. It's again protected by that knight, and that's really controlling the center of the board and putting a lot of pressure, on this f7 square, which is a weakness for Black early on, and then it allows White to castle on the king side and further his development. Now, you don't want to leave your knight here on a3, but as far as initially getting him involved into the game, bringing your knight to a3 is not a bad move. Another variation that you may see from Black is just pawn to e6. Now again, White's going to continue, and he's going to start just pushing forward with pawn to d4. And Black has two options. One, he could just take. If he exchanges right here, White's just going to recapture with his pawn again, trying to control this d4 square, but also trying to control the center of the board with his pawns. Definitely has the upper hand right now as far as initiative. From here, Black has a few options. If he wants to go ahead and get his knights involved into the game, he can. The knight could come to c6, and then White could respond with knight to f3. If Black decides instead, he could bring his pawn down to d5, and then White can go ahead and exchange right here. And then he can go ahead and develop, let's say he could develop his knight here to, c3, putting pressure on this pawn to d5. Now, again, this kind of goes along the lines of what we talked about, taking the initiative back from Black from the Sicilian defense. Any of the sharp variation lines from the Sicilian defense do not look like this with all of Black's pieces back here on the 8th row. So this is really getting your opponent out of their comfort zone. Now, he doesn't, again, have to bring his pawn down to d5. he could play another move. He could get his bishop involved into the game. He could bring his bishop down here to b4, and you could either block it, with knight to c3. You could always, place your bishop, or he could always get his another knight involved into the game to f6, attacking this pawn. The pawn can now come to e5, chasing it away, or the knight could just come here to c3. Simple development move, and also protecting this pawn here on e4. So white has a lot of the initiative, and again, this looks very different from a typical Sicilian. Another move you may see from black is pawn to d6, and again, white's going to continue with the same theme, and that's pushing forward with pawn to d4, again trying to control this d4 square right here. Now black has a few options. If he wanted to, he could always take with his pawn right here on d4, and then after white takes, white's going to have a huge advantage right here. It doesn't really matter where black goes. If he wants to go ahead and bring his knight to f6, white can just continue to develop. He can bring his knight here to c3. If black instead decided to bring his pawn to e5, pushing forward and put a little pressure here, white can just play knight to f3. Development move, center control, but white just has a lot more initiative right here. So definitely going to be a very, very strong game for black. Now, black also has the ability to, instead of playing pawn takes here on d4, he could instead bring his knight over here to f6. Now, there's a little variation difference here. Instead of, bringing your knight involved into the game, we don't want to bring our knight yet to f3 because our pawn right here on e4 is being attacked. In this case, all we have to do is bring our bishop to d3. We definitely want to make sure our light square bishop is developed into the game, so this is not a bad thing at all. And then from here, it doesn't really matter. Once, if the knight comes here to c6, putting more pressure on this pawn to d4, now white can go ahead and play knight to f3. Simple development move, controlling the center of the board. Most importantly, in this opening, defending and protecting this pawn here and the square here on d4. And now if white wanted to later on, he can go ahead and castle on the king side and then continue moving into the middle game. So again, another variation. And this, again, does not look anything like the Sicilian defense. So we're going to be going over one more variation. The last variation that we're going to be going over with is pawn to e5. So basically, white knows that he wants to go ahead and try to control this d4 square. And so if black wants to double whammy, put both of his pawns here on c5 and e5 and try to stop you from putting your pawn here on d4, he definitely may just do this. So pawn to e5 from here. White's going to play a little bit differently. Typically, white just pushes forward with pawn to d4. He's not going to do that right away. Instead, he's going to play his knight to f3, attacking this pawn here on e5 that's trying to control this d4 square right here. So black has a decision to make as far as how he's going to protect it. The most logical place, definitely doesn't want to bring his bishop here to d6 because that blocks off this pawn. It can't really move, which makes it harder for this light square bishop to get involved into the game. So typically, again, minor pieces are meant to be developed, control the center of the board, and also protect your pawns. So from here, you'll see knight to c6, simple development move, controlling and defending this pawn here on e5, so white really can't do anything. But white can now play bishop to c4. Again, kind of allowing an aggressive move from white here, putting a lot of pressure again on this f7 square, which is a huge weakness for black early on into the game. Now, depending on where black goes, let's say black develops his other knight into the game to f6, putting pressure on this pawn on e4. White typically would like to bring his knight to c3, nice central square. Again, defending this pawn here on e4, but again, as we've said in the Alapin variation, the knight cannot come here to c3 because we have our pawn here. So what's white to do? He has a nice little move of knight to g5. And what this does, it's twofold. One, it defends this pawn here on e4 from this knight here on f6, but it also does a double attack on this pawn on f7. Again, the f7 square early on is very weak because the only thing protecting it is the king. Now, again, white now has its light square bishop aimed at this f7 square and his knight. He can always, if he wants to, get his queen involved into the game. If this knight wasn't there on f6, he could bring his queen here to h5. He could always bring it to f3, putting more pressure on this f7 square. This is going to be a very, very good game from white. He has all the initiative. He's taken that away. And then later on, once he's removed this defender, then he can proceed and he can start pushing forward with pawn to d4 and control of that as well. So the Alapin variation, again, it's a very, very strong opening. Anytime you have an opponent that really enjoys playing the Sicilian defense, I recommend trying this out just to kind of get your opponent out of their comfort zone. So there's not a lot of tricks and traps and lots of variations that are just crazy with sharp tactical lines. But what this does do is it gets you into the middle game with the spatial advantage. Again, you have the initiative. So if you're a strong, chess player and you kind of like to get into the middle game with the advantage, kind of get that into the end game so you can kind of outplay your opponent, I definitely recommend this because, again, Sicilian defense, your opponent is trying to take that away from you. So check this out. Let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.